Hi there, I'm Matthew Sheffield. Welcome to Theory of Change. I got another great episode for you. But before we get into it, I wanted to mention that we are part of the flux.community network. So go to flux.community for more articles and podcasts about politics, religion, and media, and how they all intersect and the larger trends within all of these categories. So please do that. And if you like what we're doing, please go to theoryofchange.show, where you can subscribe and become a member to get access via Patreon or Substack. And if you are a member, you get full access to every episode, the transcript and the audio and the video. So I do really appreciate everybody who is a subscribing member. You make this show possible. We're not subsidized by billionaires or universities or nonprofits or anything like that. We are made possible by people like you. So thank you for subscribing, and I hope everybody else does that. And if you can't afford to subscribe, then please do help spread the word of the show. We need more people to be doing that. We got to have more written iTunes reviews. So even if it's just like a sentence or something like that saying, hey, this is a good show, I like it. That's actually helpful to people to get them to subscribe and know that it's out there. And of course, if you're on YouTube, you can push like and subscribe as well, so you can get notification every time we come out with a new episode. That is really helpful, and I'm glad that you are there, those who are doing that. And I encourage everybody else, if you're on YouTube, to do that as well. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get into today's program. Everyone seems to have a podcast nowadays. Actors, athletes, comedians, and even politicians. You clearly like them since you're here right now, and thank you for that. But what do other people think about podcasts? Well, the Pew Research Center just came out with a new report about podcasts and how people are listening and watching them. And it's an interesting piece of, the Pew Research Center just came out with a new report about podcasts and how people are listening and watching them. So joining us to talk about that today is Elisa Shearer. She is a senior researcher at the Pew Research Center, and she's worked there for 8 years, and she's the lead author of this new study that they've come out with. So thanks for being here, Elisa.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matthew.
Okay, so you guys put a lot of time into this report here. So let's maybe just start with sort of the key overall points here. What's podcasting? I think it's been growing as a medium, but it's still not as popular as radio. And but let's tell me what's your first top line, if you will.
Sure. We've been studying podcast consumption for a while through our State of the News Media report, just doing kind of top line consumption, tracking that data. And we've seen a big increase steadily since about 2006. Serial came out in 2014. You kind of see the increase start to go forward since then. What we found in our survey, and we wanted to survey Americans' opinions about the podcasts that they're hearing, why they turn to podcasts, something a little bit beyond just the industry tracking data. We found that about half of Americans, 49%, say that they've listened to a podcast in the past year. And also Americans are turning to podcasts for a variety of different reasons, including entertainment, but also learning. And the third most common reason people say is simply having something to do while they're having something to listen to while they're doing something else.
Mm-hmm. And like, what did you guys specifically ask? What other things they were doing when they were doing
we didn't ask
else?
specifically if they were doing chores or commuting. No, we didn't ask that specifically. No.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is, it is kind of an interesting thing that podcasts do have in common with radio, though, because radio, when you look at the trends, typically the place where people are listening to radio is in their car. In other words, doing something else while they are listening to that.
Yeah, and a lot of the digital media and non-digital media that we've studied has a lot to do with reading, right? So print and news websites seem like a very different type of news platform, but they're still taking all of your, or at least most of your attention, at least your visual attention. And podcasts are pretty unique in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so... But one of the other things that I guess, as somebody who listens to news podcasts myself, it was interesting to see that that's not at all the most popular format for podcast listeners, right?
No, it's not the most popular format for podcast listeners. It's not either listening to podcasts to keep up with current events is not by far the most common reason people are turning to podcasts. 29% of listeners say that they turn to podcasts to stay up to date about current events versus twice as many who say they turn to podcasts for entertainment. But we did find that a lot of podcast listeners are hearing the news on the podcast they listen to, even if they're not going there intentionally for news. So 2/3 of listeners, when we asked, regardless of why you're turning to podcasts, are you hearing about the news on the podcast you listen to? And we let people define that for themselves. It could be, they could be current political events. It could be current entertainment news. You could be listening to a comedy podcast that's talking about current events. And 2/3 of listeners say, yeah, I hear the news come up on the podcast that I'm listening to.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of it's almost passive consumption. That's what it looks like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then so some of the other, let's maybe go into some of the other more popular reasons that people gave you guys of why they listen to podcasts.
Yeah, 60% of podcast listeners said they turn to podcasts for entertainment. They said that's a major reason. A large majority said that was a major or a minor reason. 55% said they turn to podcasts to learn. Older listeners were especially likely to say that they're turning to podcasts to learn about something. And 52% of podcasts, this is the third most common reason, said that they turn to podcasts just to have something to listen to while doing something else. So kind of for that diversion reason. 30% said, going down the list, 30% said that they turn to podcasts to hear other people's opinions. 29%, like I said, say they turn to podcasts to stay up to date about current events. And 27%, about the same amount as who said current events, say they turn to podcasts for encouragement or for inspiration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then and I think that's related in terms of the formats that people are talking about. So you guys had discussed that. I mean, like, with respect to comedy or entertainment, like what how does it break down a little bit further beyond that?
Yeah, so we also asked separately, after we asked the reasons that people are turning to podcasts, we asked about the topics that people are listening to. So do you regularly listen to podcasts about X? Comedy and entertainment were at the top. So comedy was 47%, entertainment was 46%. Again, when we ask people these questions, we're letting them define the topics for themselves. So someone might listen to a comedic true crime podcast, for example, and they might say, yes, I regularly listen to both podcasts about comedy and podcasts about true crime, just because that's how they're thinking of that. Politics and government, science and technology, history were next. They're all around 40%. And then you get to true crime, self-help and relationships. They're about 1/3. A little less popular, but still named by about 1/3. Money and finance, religion and spirituality. And then going down the list, health and fitness was a topic named by 27% of listeners. Sports, named by 22%, and race and ethnicity, named by 15%. So what I found striking about the topic list was that no one topic really rises above everything else. Nothing's really dominating this list. It has 12 topics, and I think 9 of them are named by 1/3 to 1/2 of listeners. So it's really people are turning to a broad array of podcasts for a variety of different reasons.
Mm-hmm. And then how did things break down in terms of age?
So by age is pretty interesting. Like we see with other digital formats, young people are a lot more likely to be turning to podcasts. Adults ages 18 to 29, 2/3 of them say they've listened to a podcast in the past year. When you get to 65 plus, it's just 28%, and 50 to 64, it's 42%. So there's a big age difference looking at podcast listeners, like you see when you ask about going to social media or getting news on social media, or going online has plateaued a little bit, to be honest, because online news websites, there's less of an age difference than we've seen in the past. What I think is interesting is that podcast listeners of different ages are churning there for different reasons. So it's not just that older listeners are kind of less likely to go, less likely to say, to respond to a number of different questions. They're saying specifically, I'm turning to these podcasts for something else. So older listeners are a lot less likely to say they're turning to podcasts for entertainment or diversion, that to have something to listen to while doing something else. The most common reason that older listeners are turning to podcasts is learning. And they're also a little bit more likely than younger listeners to say that they're going to podcasts to stay up to date about current events. So that's not just that older Americans are less likely to go to podcasts in general, but the older Americans who are turning to podcasts are doing it for a different reason than younger Americans.
Yeah, and I think that does kind of it's reflected in terms of how people of different age groups are using television. So like younger people tend to not really watch television
Yep,
much
that's
at
totally
all.
true.
And then whereas the older you are, the more likely you are to like television. And
Yep.
and like you see that with the ratings for all the major news channels, for instance.
Yeah, and that's something that we've seen in our media research historically. While we were tracking the increase of online news consumption, it's among those over 50, TV is consistently a really common news source, and it's not a common news source at all for younger adults.
Mm-hmm. And what's kind of interesting about it, though, is that I think I've wondered sometimes that while people may think that their I don't know their consumption of a news or entertainment product is different than an older or younger person's, are they really all that different? In other words, like if you're listening to a podcast about, I don't know, entertainment, like a bunch of comedians having their podcast and making jokes to each other, like how different really is that from turning to Comedy Central and watching, like a roast of somebody?
Great question. And I think that, yeah, the medium is changing, but we still see, for example, a lot of people, I think about half of podcast listeners say that they're hearing political opinions on the podcast that they're listening to.